American presidents today, and for a long time, they act almost like elected kings, with massive powers and very little accountability, if any at all. But that wasn't the actual plan. And if it was the plan behind the scenes, that's not how it was sold to the ratifying public. So responding to anti-Federalist warnings that presidents would eventually degenerate into some form of a monarchy, Federalist writers like Tench Coxe, John Dickinson, James Iredell, and many others went into great detail to explain how the power of the executive branch would be extremely limited, especially in comparison to the British Monarchy that they fought a long, bloody war to get away from just a number of years earlier. They fought a long war to secede from. And of course, well, there's Hamilton's take as well. So on this episode, I'm going to go through the highlights and provide you a brief introductory reading list at the end as well. But first of all, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, August 7th, 2024. And let's get right to this. Here from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at University of Wisconsin, great resource. They point out that Americans had considerable experience with executives. No doubt, we all have, haven't we? They had lived under the British king, who had power to veto colonial acts of legislation before they went into effect. The Articles of Confederation actually provided for no separate executive. There was a president of Congress, but not wielding executive power like we understand it today. But they say the Confederation Congress did elect its own president, who served more or less as the Speaker of Congress. They point out again that during the ratification debates, as I mentioned right at the outset, anti-Federalists charged that the president would become an elected monarch, that cabals would develop to ensure his reelection, and that the presidential veto power would be abused. I mean, that's a pretty good description of what we live under today. Certainly, some kind of an elected monarch, cabals working to elect one side or the other, and the veto power abused or not used when it should be, which is also, to me, an abuse of power. They further feared that a presidential power to grant pardons would allow the president to conspire with others in treasonable activities with impunity. Now, for example, a writer from Virginia that most people aren't familiar with, Tammany, wrote, "Though not dignified with the magic name of king." I like how he says the magic name of king. Though not dignified with the magic name of king, he will possess more supreme power than Great Britain allows her hereditary monarchs. And similar arguments were made by people like Patrick Henry, George Mason, Luther Martin, Brutus, Sentinel, Impartial Examiner, many others. I went into some detail going through the anti-Federalist arguments about concerns and warnings about the executive branch in an episode just last month. That'll be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But let's get to the Federalist responses. Here's Mike Meharry writing about Tench Coxe, and he said, in his first essay of an American citizen, I think this was September of 1787, so just barely a week after the Philadelphia Convention was done, Tench Coxe took on this notion that the president would effectively be an American king, carefully delineating the difference between the executive and the constitutional system and the British monarch. That was a very important argument that they were making out. First, he made the case that the British king was also the head of the established church, and he put it like this: the British king is the great bishop or supreme head of an established church with an immense patronage annexed. In this capacity, he commands a number of votes in the House of Lords by creating bishops who, besides their great incomes, have voted in that assembly and are judges in the last resort. So he's inserting his team and paying them off and giving them roles, and then they get to make decisions that, well, we shouldn't be surprised if they're different or they're not different from what he wants. They also have many honorable and lucrative places to bestow, and thus from their wealth, learning, dignities, powers, and patronage, given a great luster and an enormous influence to the crown. And that's Tench Coxe discussing the first step. Now, he said the American president would not have that kind of influence, or at least not supposed to. In America, he wrote, our president will not only be without these influencing advantages, but they will be in the possession of the people at large. to strengthen their hands in the event of a contest with him. So Tench Coxe was thinking, there might be a contest between the people and the people's representatives and the states' representatives and the executive. So he thought that was on the table at some point. In short, danger from ecclesiastical tyranny. That's something that was a big part of creating the New World. That long-standing and still remaining curse of the people, that sacrilegious engine of royal power in some countries, can be feared by no man in the United States. That argument makes some sense to me, for sure. Mike Meharry points out that Coxe next pointed out that a king remains on the throne for life. In America, he said, our president will always be one of the people at the end of 4 years. And given, Mike writes, that kingship is hereditary, so these are some of the difference. If you're saying, it's going to have more power, the argument was it's going to have more power than the British monarch or be like a British monarchy. And we just fought a war to get away from it. And Tench Coxe is kind of going through some of the things that make the British monarch what it is and why they got away from this ecclesiastical tyranny. And of course, being on the throne, a hereditary throne for life. He said, and given that kingship is hereditary, he can be... This is awesome. An idiot, a knave, or a tyrant by nature, or ignorant from neglect of his education. But he cannot be removed from office. In fact, it was assumed that a king could, quote, do no wrong. So you could have a total idiot, a total knave, a tyrant, basically a sociopath or a psychopath. And that's also a pretty good description of what we have generally for presidents today. In contrast, and unfortunately, it's the people choosing that. So I think that's the argument that the Federalists would make. In contrast, the president was originally one of the people, and he is created by their breath. Now, Coxe also pointed out that I'm not going to just talk about Tench Coxe, but these are really interesting. In fact, it was one of the first kind of overviews defending the executive branch from the Federalist side, well before the Federalist Papers were even started, and far more influential because these were reprinted throughout the various states during the ratification debates, whereas the Federalist Papers really didn't have any influence outside of New York State until after ratification. Then it had a lot of influence on Supreme Court opinions, especially much more today. So it has an outsized influence. Those papers had an outsized influence today, although I will cite some of them a little bit later in the show. Now, Coxe also pointed out that under the Constitution, there is no assumption of presidential infallibility. And under the British monarchy, the king could do no wrong. Whatever they decided to do, in essence, they were infallible. It appears, Tench writes, we have not admitted that he can do no wrong, but have rather presupposed that he may and sometimes will do wrong by providing for his impeachment, his trial, and his peaceable and complete removal. You don't have to have a revolution to get him out of office. Well, at least you're not supposed to have a revolution to get these people out of office. And in fact, they didn't even want to have term limits to get them out of office. The founders really wanted to rely on the people to do the right thing. And when they don't, as Benjamin Franklin warned, everything, doesn't matter what you set up, you're going to degenerate into a tyranny. Now, Meharry also points out that there was a really significant blending in the British system between executive and legislative power because the king had authority over some of what went on there. And he writes that Coxe also pointed out royal powers that presidents would not be allowed to exercise. For instance, the king was able to actually create members of the House of Lords, the upper chamber. So the king, or that would be the executive branches, choosing a senator, for example. He said, our president not only cannot make members of the upper house, but their creation, like his own, is by the people through their representatives. So he can't do that. That certainly is a difference between the British system and, of course, what he's discussing here. Perhaps most significantly, Mike writes, while the king possessed legislative power, the president wasn't delegated any authority to make laws. Under the Constitution, the president is only authorized to insert himself into the legislative process with a veto. And if you listen or watch that episode that I did on anti-federalist arguments, not everybody was concerned about the veto power, but those who were thought it was a big problem crossing over this legislative and executive powers. The idea that they shouldn't be blended at all. Impartial Examiner, of course, was one who said, well, if they have legislative powers and legislative and executive need to be separate, then, having a veto and requiring them to do something is making the executive part of the legislative branch. Now, the Federalists recognized that this was the case, but they did not think this was an improper blending of the powers. Again, here from Tench Coxe, he said, in all great cases affecting the national interest or safety, his modified and restrained power. So again, if you're comparing it to the British monarchy, the British king had an absolute veto, not only on stuff that was passed, but on stuff anywhere in the colonies, on any local issue as well. Total veto power. In all great cases, he writes, affecting the national interest or safety, his modified and restrained power must give way to the sense of 2/3 of the legislature. And in fact, it amounts to no more than a serious duty imposed upon him to request both houses to reconsider any matter on which he entertains doubts or feels apprehensions. And here, the people have a strong hold upon him from his sole and personal responsibility. Now, unfortunately, they don't wield that veto power nearly as often as they should. Basically, anything that Congress passes in modern times really should have been vetoed. Force them to go through the process. But they keep signing this stuff. They keep signing this stuff. They keep signing this stuff. John Dickinson is another one. He was probably the lead drafter of the Articles of Confederation. He was also known as the penman of the American Revolution, very famous writer. Here he is as Fabius II in April of 1788. He said, the president, discussing this veto power as well, the president will be no dictator. 2/3 of the representatives and the Senate may pass any law, notwithstanding his dissent, and he is removable and punishable for misbehavior. Again, these are things that are not used properly, but that's when they're talking about the structure. If you're saying, oh, this is more powerful than the king, you can see how the Federalists are saying, look, he can veto anything, and it doesn't matter what these other houses, House of Commons, House of Lords, they can say whatever they want, but if the king has a different opinion, it doesn't matter. And here we're creating a system where he doesn't have that kingly power, and of course, they can take him out of office peaceably. And in Fabius number 9, Dickinson also listed a bunch of powers that the British monarch would have that are far beyond what was delegated to the president or the executive branch under the Constitution. A hereditary monarch, he said, with a vast revenue, absolute in the erection and disposal of offices, and in the exercise of the whole executive power, in the command of the militia, fleets, and armies, and the direction of their operations, in the establishment of fairs and markets, the regulation of weights and measures, and of coining money, who can call parliaments with a breath and dissolve them with a nod, which of course they dealt with during the Revolution, just shutting down a legislature on a whim. And so then the people have, beyond not having representation in parliament, they didn't even have representation locally because the king decided that they didn't like it, or some representative of the king. They can call parliaments with a breath, dissolve them with a nod, who can at his will make war, peace, and treaties, irrevocably binding the nation, and who can grant pardons or titles of nobility as it pleases him. And that, to Dickinson, made it a huge difference between the system under the Constitution. Now, of course, all this stuff will be linked to, as I mentioned, in the show notes. Alan Mosley does an awesome job organizing a blog post for every single episode. I get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Again, there's a show notes section for every episode. And there, if you scroll down the blog post, you'll be able to see all the things that I'm discussing here. Dickinson, Tench Coxe, Meharry's article, another episode, the Anti-Federalist episode, etc. Plus, we also list all the different platforms around. We link to all of them as well for each episode. So if we happen to be missing from one someday, well, let's find out where they are. Because, of course, we live stream on the mainstream platforms like YouTube and X and Facebook and Twitch. And I don't know, I'm probably forgetting one, but we also live stream over at rumble.com and odyssey.com, which is awesome. The communities are growing there, and it's really great to see these so-called alternative platforms that aren't run by the establishment, or, well, hopefully they stay like that. And then we have the audio-only podcast edition in as many places as possible. If you see us missing from one of your favorite platforms, please do let us know either through a comment or email at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. While I'm here, I want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you guys being here. There's the Rumble crew, which is just consistent and awesome. Gypsy and Dennis and Brewster. I appreciate you guys using the platform over there. I got to figure out how to get Odyssey's live chat up on my screen. I'll get that one of these days. There's Jug and Haji, Chris and Diana, Scott, Kirk, and a number of other people over on YouTube. I know I'm missing over a few people. There's Brett, who says on Facebook, they are puppets that act like kings. They certainly are. So, well, I mean, whether you think they're a puppet of other people or they are the ones as the source of power or it's the deep state, but certainly the executive power is incredibly vast, and it's nowhere close to where it should be. There's Cheriton Farmer and a few others people. Again, I appreciate you being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. But let's get right back to this. And Anti-Federalists also felt that the treaty power was an improper blending of legislative and executive powers. Of course, they were citing the celebrated Montesquieu from the Spirit of the Laws, saying, well, we take the position that you can't have any overlap between legislative, executive, and judicial power. The Federalists said, well, you have to keep them separate, but there can be some overlap. And in some ways, even they cited Montesquieu, and maybe one of these days I could get into kind of a real nitty-gritty detailed episode discussing Montesquieu and the various discussions about it from Anti-Federalists and Federalists, but that's for another time. But they basically said that Montesquieu held the position that you could have blending in certain areas, kind of especially for defensive things like the veto power. And here's James Iredell, who was one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court. He was writing as Marcus, a specific response to George Mason. And I think that would also be an interesting episode, since I just did one recently on George Mason's Anti-Federalist objections to the Constitution. So here's Iredell responding, talking specifically about the treaty power. He said, the power of making treaties is so important that it would have been highly dangerous to vest it in the executive alone. Because if you can't have some kind of check and balance, the Federalists were arguing, if the president can negotiate a treaty but can't implement it without at least the representatives of the states. And keep in mind, this is before the 17th Amendment. So the Senate had a much different kind of structure and understanding of what its reason to exist was. Rather than being popular, having an election by popular vote, what James Madison said, if they ever did that, this would be a totally consolidated system and it would be terrible for liberty. But again, that's another story. So if you weren't going to have this kind of combination where the president has to be ratified by the Senate or somebody, then one area, one branch has to have that power on its own possibly. And he's saying just giving it to the executive branch alone is incredibly dangerous, because that's more like a king than anything. He said it's highly dangerous to vest it in the executive alone and would have been the subject of much greater clamor. From the nature of the thing, it could not be vested in the popular representative. He doesn't make a reasoning why, but maybe we just accept that on its face. He said it must therefore have been provided for with the Senate's concurrence or the concurrence of a privy council, something that George Mason wanted. He wanted a plural executive, so did many other anti-federalists, also Benjamin Franklin on the Federalist side. He said, or the concurrence of a privy council, a thing which I believe nobody has been mad enough to propose, or the power, the greatest monarchical power that can be exercised, must have been vested in a manner that would have excited universal indignation in the president alone. So Iredell saying, okay, you guys are complaining about this treaty power. You're warning that this is really kind of just swarming up the branches and kind of tying them together. But here, what's the alternative is what he's saying. He also addressed the anti-federalist view again that legislative, executive, and judicial power had to be completely separate with no blending at all. He said the rule, therefore, from the example of the freest government in Europe, that might be an oxymoron, that the legislative and executive powers must be altogether distinct is liable to exceptions. It does not mean that the executive shall not form a part of the legislative, nor can it mean that the Crown must consult neither house as to any exercise of the executive power. He's saying, like, look, he's not in charge of legislation, is the case that Iredell and so many other Federalists made. He's just asking for their approval. But its meaning must be, said, that one power shall not include both authorities. The king, for instance, shall not have the sole executive and sole legislative authority also. He may have the former, but must participate in the latter with the two houses of Parliament. In his second essay, Americanus, not someone we discuss on the Federalist side too often, he was just railing on the Anti-Federalist writer Cato, who I think made some very good arguments. I covered Cato's essays in a full series a while back. Maybe I should revisit that with an overview of the cases that he made, but he specifically is talking to Cato. The comparison, he said, which Cato has thought to hit his purpose is to institute between a British monarch and a president under the Constitution, is surely unworthy of attention. This is kind of an arrogant response here. It also is not an unusual one from the Federalist side. He said it must excite ridicule and contempt in every man when he considers, on one side, the dreadful catalogue of unnecessary but dangerous prerogatives which, in the British government, is vested in the Crown, and on the other side, takes a view of the powers with which this Constitution has clothed the President. And then he goes through all this list: imperial dignity tied in with the church, being able to create members in the House of Lords, etc., etc. Say this is absurd to say that these two things are the same or this one here is worse. And here's his list: imperial dignity and hereditary succession, constituting an independent branch of the legislature, the creation of peers and distribution of titles and dignities, the supremacy of the national church, the appointment of archbishops and bishops, the power of convening, proroguing, and dissolving the Parliament, the fundamental maxim that the king can do no wrong, to be above the reach of all courts of law. So the executive branch is not above all the courts of law, to be accountable to no power whatever in the nation, his person to be sacred and inviolable. They're saying it is absurd. It isn't even worthy of attention. Although, while saying it's not worthy of attention, he gives it plenty of attention here, Americanus did. He said the sole power of making war and peace, making treaties, leagues, and alliances, the collection, management, and expenditure of an immense revenue deposited annually in the royal exchequer, with the appointment of an almost innumerable tribe of officers. Well, they do that today, for sure. Dependent thereon, all these prerogatives, besides a great many more, which it is unnecessary to detail here, none of all which are vested in the president, put together, form an accumulation of power of immense magnitude. He's just saying this is not a set of powers that are authorized to the executive branch. Now let's talk about our big supporter of big government, Alexander Hamilton, because he wrote a ton on executive power. For example, Federalist number 69, I believe. Yeah, 69. I think it was originally listed as 68 when it was printed. But he said that a magistrate is to be elected for 4 years and is to be re-eligible as often as the people of the United States shall think him worthy of their confidence. He's saying that magistrate can only be around for 4 years, and as long as they want him around, he'll stick around. And he's saying, well, the monarch is around whether the people want him or not, whether the people are smart or dumb about who they choose as their leader or not. In these circumstances, he said, there is a total dissimilitude between him and a king of Great Britain, who is an hereditary monarch, possessing the crown as a patrimony descendable to his heirs forever. I mean, that should be pretty obvious that is different. Now, was this a kind of a propaganda, kind of a block and pivot? You know, were the Anti-Federalists saying that the king or the American president would have these kingly powers? I don't really see that. So it seems almost like a misdirection in response, less of a direct response to what they were complaining about, how it would lead to more power, and more of a, well, let's look at the actual differences and get people to focus on that instead. Here's Hamilton again. I think this is also Federalist 69. I should double check. Yep. The President of the United States would be liable to be impeached, tried, and upon conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes or misdemeanors, removed from office, and would afterwards be liable to prosecution and punishment in the ordinary course of law. That's Hamilton. I mean, Hamilton is saying, well, a king can't be impeached and kicked out of office and then tried in a court of law. But the executive branch, the president of the United States, according to Alexander Hamilton, the guy who supported centralized power in the hands of an elected king, really, more than anybody at the time. And he's saying, yeah, this is the difference. He said, the person of the King of Great Britain is sacred and inviolable. There is no constitutional tribunal to which he is amenable. No punishment to which he can be subjected without involving the crisis of a national revolution. You can't get him out without a bloody war, really. In this delicate and important circumstance of personal responsibility, the president of a confederated America would stand upon no better ground than a governor of New York, and upon worse ground than the governors of Maryland and Delaware. Well, at least at the time. And then he also talked about military power, being the commander-in-chief. Of course, we know that the executive branch doesn't have the power to declare and wage war like in the King of Great Britain. And that was one of the things that they did intentionally. James Madison called that what he called the wisest part of the Constitution. And no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the part where you separate the power of declaring and waging war between the legislature and the executive. And here's Hamilton discussing the commander-in-chief as well. He said the president is to be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. In this respect, his authority would be nominally the same with that of the King of Great Britain, but in substance, much inferior to it. It would amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces as first general and admiral of the Confederacy. I like how he uses Confederacy before ratification, and then that changes. But anyways, he's going to be the first general and admiral of the Confederacy, while that of a British king extends to the declaring of war and to the raising and regulating of fleets and armies, all which by the Constitution under consideration would appertain to the legislature. So the executive branch could declare war and then wage it. Madison specifically explained why they separate it, because the person who can also declare war might declare war so they can wage it. And this was supposed to be a check on that instinct, that kind of flawed part in human nature. People who rise to that level of power will certainly wield that power in very bad ways. Now, James Wilson, I've seen some papers discussing him as really the creator of the modern executive branch. And I think we should probably do an article discussing him in much more detail. He didn't speak about it expressly and very specifically too often, especially in the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention in November and December of 1787. But he did address the very common anti-Federalist preference for an executive council rather than a singular, or what we call today a unitary executive. I guess that might be overstating what he was talking about, but he probably was on board with some of that as well. He said the executive power is better to be trusted when it has no screen. He felt that if you were going to go with George Mason's approach or what Benjamin Franklin preferred at the Philadelphia Convention, but this wasn't known to people because that was secret, but many of the anti-Federalists, some of the Federalists, I think it was like Edmund Randolph and Hugh Williamson in Philadelphia, also preferred like 2 or 3 or 4 people to have the executive power, even if there was basically like a CEO, and then he had kind of a guiding council to keep them in check. But he thought it was better to have a single person. Sir, we have a responsibility in the person of our president. He cannot act improperly and hide either his negligence or inattention. He cannot roll upon any other person the weight of his criminality. And that was the mentality that Iredell or that Wilson and others had, that if you had a group of executives, then everyone could point blame to the other. Oh, well, my counsel said to do this. And certainly we hear that. We certainly hear that with the teams of today, like the last administration, every time. And in fact, it's not even as much the executives themselves, but the people who are so attached to an individual. They love an individual rather than support them for following their oath. And when they do stuff that's terrible for the Constitution and liberty, they say, oh, well, he was just listening to his team and he made a bad choice. This is basically what James Wilson was saying shouldn't happen under the Constitution. He cannot act improperly and hide his negligence or inattention. He cannot roll upon any other person the weight of his criminality. No appointment can take place without his nomination, and he is responsible for every nomination he makes. So if the executive branch appoints a bunch of terrible idiots to run various executive departments or agencies, well, that most of them shouldn't exist, The buck stops where? With the person who put them in charge. Now, unfortunately, the people will turn a blind eye to that so many times a day and not hold the executive branch accountable. But Wilson continues, we secure vigor. We know well that what numerous executives are. We know that there is neither vigor, decision, nor responsibility in them. Now, of course, vigor meant power. Energy was another term. So Wilson, Hamilton, Governor Morris, and many others on the Federalist side wanted a very strong executive to wield power to keep things together. Now, here's Hamilton talking about that veto power as well. He said he looked at it as a defensive power. An absolute or qualified negative in the executive upon the acts of the legislative body is admitted by the ablest adepts in political science to be an indispensable barrier against the encroachments of the latter upon the former. James Madison, when he discussed how parchment barriers don't keep governments in check, he mostly was concerned with the legislative branch doing all kinds of stuff that went beyond their limits. Executive power usurped was one of the examples that he gave, I believe, in Federalist 48 or a letter to Thomas Jefferson later in the year, or both. But this was a big concern for the Federalist side. So this here is, I think this is Iredell in the North Carolina. This is James Iredell in the North Carolina ratifying convention. He said, in a Republican government, it would be extremely dangerous to place it in the power of one man to put an absolute negative on a bill proposed by two houses, one of which represented the people, the other states of America. That's a little hat tip to the structure of how the Senate was supposed to be as well. Representatives of the states, they were chosen by state legislatures at the time. He said it therefore became an object of consideration how the executive could defend itself without being a component part of the legislature. Anti-Federalist said by having the veto power, he is a component part of the legislature because he is, and also signing, he is making a decision on what laws will be passed. So he is a component part. Federalists are saying, no, without this, the legislature will just run wild and there's nothing to defend against it. The executive, he said, is not entirely at the mercy of the legislature, nor is it put in the power of the executive entirely to defeat the acts of those two important branches. So Iredell is taking the position, like Hamilton and others, that this is a kind of a balance of these things. And summing it up, I think James Madison put it best. He said, the natural province of the executive magistrate is to execute laws, as that of the legislature is to make laws. All his acts, therefore, properly executive, must presuppose the existence of the laws to be executed. That might say a little something about executive orders or signing statements which actually change legislation or kind of create things out of thin air. But Madison said in order to execute, you have to presuppose that a law already existed. Now, one of the most famous Federalist arguments in favor of what we call today the Unitary executive, I could do a whole episode just on Federalist number 70 from Alexander Hamilton. This is very famous. It was not influential during the ratification debates because, well, this was written for a New York audience, and it wasn't published until March of 1788. So most of the states had already ratified by this time. Of course, New York had not, Virginia had not, but it wasn't really published outside of the state of New York. But of course, people who love centralized power, people who love executive power, will always cite Federalist 70. You can look online and see all kinds of stuff, even if you went to the Wikipedia page, for Federalist 70, you could see all kinds of modern justifications for all kinds of unconstitutional executive power attributed to Federalist number 70. Now, personally, I think this one is very popular amongst kind of constitutional scholars, legal scholars, what they call themselves, legal experts, historians, supporters of the monster state, is because it does make the most extreme case in support of the most powerful unitary executive from the founding. I do urge you to read it, but I think it's a bit of an outlier, even amongst some of the Federalists of the time. James Wilson probably liked it. I would think Governor Morris did, but even people like Randolph, Roger Sherman, Benjamin Franklin, Hugh Williamson, and others were not fans of this type of executive power. But here's how he kicks it off. This is right at the beginning of Alexander Hamilton's Federalist 70. Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. It is not less essential to the steady administration of the laws, to the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice, to the security of liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy. That bugbear, anarchy always. But then he says, look through history. Look at Rome. We needed a dictator in order to be free. And that was his mentality. He told Thomas Jefferson some years later at a dinner party, the greatest man who ever lived was Julius Caesar. So this was his idol. He said, every man the least conversant in Roman story knows how often that republic was obliged to take refuge in the absolute power of a single man under the formidable title of dictator, as well against the intrigues of ambitious individuals who aspired to the tyranny and the seditions of whole classes of the community whose conduct threatened the existence of all government, don't threaten me with a good time, as against the invasions of external enemies who menaced the conquest and destruction of Rome. So here's Hamilton singing praise for a dictatorship. So even if this is the most famous, most versed, cited Federalist argument in support of strong executive power, we have to kind of read it with that context. I'll leave the rest of it to you to read on your own time. Now, although it should be obvious that presidential power today goes far beyond how any of these Federalists, except maybe Hamilton, described the power of the president under the executive branch, under the Constitution. And I think there's a really strong case to be made that many of the Anti-Federalist warnings were actually spot on, especially if you check out my other episode on that. Going through how the Federalists described things, I think it clearly demonstrates to all of us that the bloated imperial executive branch we live under today was not what the people of the several states agreed to when they ratified the Constitution, period. In other words, most of what the executive power is today is just simply illegitimate. And that's a big reason why we believe it's so essential to reach out to more and more people and educate them on this essential, forgotten, and even ignored history. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. I'd be very grateful to any consideration you can give to joining us as a member today. No pressure, but if you do have the ability to do so and you're motivated to support us, again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can also do some free, easy peasy things to help us spread the word. Smash the like, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments, especially in the archive, subscribe, get notifications. All these things can help trigger the algorithms of the mainstream platforms and tell them to show us to more people. I really appreciate your help. I'll have to read through some comments and questions in the chat a little bit later today or tomorrow. I do read through virtually all of it. I don't get a chance to reply to much, but I appreciate your feedback. I got a lot of ideas for future episodes from your comments and you sharing your thoughts and perspective. And of course, that helps us reach more people as well. Again, thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. And I hope to see you next time here. Oh, I forgot the reading list. Tench Coxe, American Citizen #1. John Dickinson is Fabius #2 and Fabius #9. James Iredell, it's Marcus. I think it's 1 and 2. And then Hamilton, you got to read Federalist #66, 69, and 70. These will all be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Okay, now I can wrap it up. Thank you so much for being here. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.